Some monsters hide in the dark, others wear your brother's face. In this version of the story, Jonathan Byers isn't just the quiet older sibling or the moody photographer keeping to himself in the corners of the frame. He's something else, something much worse. Not by choice, but by design. Because what if the Mind Flayer didn't just find a host? What if it had always had one? It started long before the lights began to flicker in Hawkins. Jonathan used to have dreams, distorted, looping things full of static and shadows. As a kid, he'd wake up sweating, clutching the sheets, convinced something had been in the room with him. He tried to explain it once, to his mom, to Lonnie, but it didn't go anywhere. Joyce said he just had an overactive imagination. Lonnie told him to man up, and after a while, Jonathan just stopped talking about it altogether. But the dreams kept coming. They grew darker and stranger. By the time he was 13, he'd stopped sleeping with the light off, not because he was afraid of monsters. He just didn't want to see what the darkness showed him when he closed his eyes. There were shapes in there, shadows that crawled. Places he didn't recognize but felt familiar. Sometimes he woke up with nosebleeds. Sometimes he woke up on the floor and had no idea how he got there. No one ever noticed. He was good at hiding the cracks. When the gate first opened under Hawkins' lab, it was 11 who made the break, but it was Jonathan who unknowingly held the door open. Something about him, his silence, his sorrow, the way he carried grief like an anchor, made him the perfect tether. A living fault line, a fracture in the world that never healed right. The scientists thought they were observing an accident of power, but the truth was far older. The darkness had already been watching Hawkins. It had already chosen. And it chose him, not for strength, but for pain. In Season 1, when Will disappeared, Jonathan seemed like the older brother stepping up, the one putting up flyers, digging through photos, confronting his fear head on. But what we didn't see, what no one saw, was what he was drawing toward them with every step. He didn't understand it, not fully, but strange things started happening when he got too close to the search. He'd take pictures, and sometimes when he developed them, he'd see things that weren't there in real life. Figures in the corners, static where there should have been trees. Once in the background of a photo of Steve and Nancy, there was a shape, tall, wrong, pulsing with shadow. He burned that one before anyone else could see it. He kept losing time, waking up in strange places. The walls in his room sometimes pulsed when no one else was home. He'd hear knocking, but there was no one at the door. He thought he was losing it. Maybe he was. But the darkness wasn't chaotic. It was precise. Jonathan's rage, his resentment, his fear, it all fed something he couldn't name, and it grew stronger every time he swallowed his feelings, every time he let himself drift further away from the world. While everyone else searched for Will in the woods, the Upside Down was stretching behind the drywall of his closet, and it was listening. Joyce chalked it up to stress. She thought he was just grieving in his own way. The Byers' house was already a mess, emotionally and literally, so no one questioned why Jonathan was quieter than usual, or why he'd spend hours sitting in the dark room, staring at nothing. Nancy visited at times. He smiled, said he was fine, but even she noticed that his eyes looked different, hollow in a way that made her uncomfortable. What no one could have imagined was that the Mind Flayer wasn't coming to Hawkins by accident. It wasn't stumbling into people's minds at random. It was following a path. Jonathan's path. And the gate wasn't in Hawkins' lab anymore. Not really. It was living rent-free behind the eyes of a boy no one was watching closely enough. By the time Season 2 rolled around, Hawkins had already changed. The town was cracking beneath the surface. The leaves looked sick. The air hung heavier than it should. People whispered about headaches, power flickers, and radio static, but nobody ever connected it to the boy with the camera who kept to himself. They were all looking at 11, at Will, at Hopper's case files, but the real fracture was happening in silence, underneath Jonathan Byers' skin. He still showed up when needed. He helped expose Hawkins' lab with Nancy. He stayed close to Will during his episodes. He played the role of the watchful brother, the quiet support system, the boy who was always there but never fully seen. And it worked. Nobody noticed the way his hands shook when no one was looking, or how he sometimes stood still in the middle of a hallway for minutes, staring at nothing. He chalked it up to stress. They all did. The truth was, the link was growing. At night, he could feel it pulse. Something like a heartbeat, but it wasn't his. It echoed through his head like a second rhythm, always there, always louder when he was angry or scared, and his emotions fed it. That's what disturbed him most. The more lost he felt, the more powerful the connection became. He stopped sleeping, stopped dreaming, or maybe just forgot how. Sometimes he'd find black marks under his nails and didn't remember digging into anything. Other times he'd catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror and for a split second swear his reflection didn't move in sync. Will's possession in Season 2 didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Jonathan had been there when it started. He held his brother through the fever, the spasms, the mindless drawing. But what no one saw was how Jonathan sometimes felt drawn to the sketches, like they made perfect sense, like they were plans he had already seen somewhere else. He didn't say anything, he just stared too long, memorizing each line as if the maps were written in a language only he was born to understand. When the Mind Flayer tightened its grip on Will, Jonathan got worse. His moods shifted violently, lashing out one minute, numbed the next. The hallway lights at school would flicker when he walked past. Static crackled from radios in his presence. Cameras malfunctioned when he tried to develop film. Nancy noticed. She didn't say anything for a while, but she started watching him differently. Sometimes she'd knock on the Byers' door and ask about Will, but really, she was checking on Jonathan. He always smiled. He always said he was fine, but it felt like he was saying it from behind glass. There was a night in late October when the illusion slipped. Jonathan had wandered into the woods. He told himself it was just to clear his head, but he didn't really know why he'd gone. Something pulled at him, something quiet and constant. The further he walked, the less he felt like himself. Time warped. The trees seemed wrong, taller, slicker, almost wet to the touch. The moonlight bounced off everything like it was underwater. He stumbled into a clearing and found a patch of black vines pulsing against the dirt. At first, he froze, unsure if he was dreaming again. But then they moved, not away from him, but toward him. They wrapped around his foot, then his ankle. He didn't scream. He didn't even fight. Instead, he stood there as if some buried part of him expected it. And in that moment, he understood something he'd been trying not to admit. The Upside Down knew him. Intimately. Personally. It didn't need to force its way in. It was already inside. After that, things started to fall apart. He began blacking out in short bursts, losing minutes, then hours. He'd come to in random places, his car, the high school parking lot, once in the attic of the abandoned library. The last thing he'd remembered was being at home. Sometimes he'd wake up with dried blood on his hands. Not his, not anyone's maybe, but it was real. Joyce grew more worried, but she was distracted. Will was getting worse. The house felt like a war zone again. The flickering lights, the walls groaning, the temperature dropping. And Jonathan kept saying he was fine. He meant it, most of the time. He found one of his old sketchbooks one night, tucked behind his bed, untouched since childhood. Inside were pages of things he didn't remember drawing. Spindly creatures. Eyeless things. Black webs creeping out of people's mouths. One page had a crude drawing of the cabin in the woods where Elle would eventually train with Hopper. Another page showed the Mind Flayer, sketched before anyone in Hawkins had ever seen it. It wasn't prediction. It wasn't imagination. It was memory. His. Eleven sensed it too. At first, she couldn't place the feeling, just an itch in her mind when Jonathan entered the room. Like something familiar, but warped. She avoided him subtly, subconsciously. Eventually, during one of her psychic dives to locate Will, she crossed paths with Jonathan's energy, and it was wrong. She didn't tell anyone, not yet, but the image stuck with her. Jonathan standing alone in the woods, eyes black, shadows pouring from his chest into the sky. By the time the Mind Flayer retreated from Will, Jonathan was different. He felt stronger, sharper, like the storm that had been inside him finally had direction. He stopped flinching, he stopped doubting, but he also stopped feeling, in a way that was hard to explain. Music didn't sound the same. Food didn't taste like anything. Even photography lost its meaning. The world had become hollow, as if he was only half inside it. And every now and then, he'd hear the voice. Not exactly words, just a feeling, a presence brushing against his thoughts like wind against a window. It didn't threaten him, it invited him in. The line between Jonathan and the thing growing beneath Hawkins had thinned to almost nothing. He was no longer just near the gate, he was the gate. The truth didn't come in a flash, it unfolded slowly, like a photograph submerged in developer fluid, lines surfacing, shadows forming until the image became impossible to ignore. By the time Vecna rose in Season 4, the town of Hawkins was already on the brink of collapse. The earth cracked open, houses swallowed whole, But for the people closest to Jonathan Byers, the real break happened quietly, between words, between glances, in the moments when he looked more like a reflection than a person. Joyce noticed him, the change in how he moved, the way he stood too still when things were loud, the way he avoided touching anything for too long. There was no specific moment, just a mounting dread that something had hollowed out the boy she raised and left something behind that wore his voice. Nancy found it next. Old photos, audio tapes warped by static, footage of the Upside Down caught on film, days before any of them had entered it. She'd thought they were coincidences, anomalies, but the closer she looked, the more consistent they became. Jonathan had always been near the fractures. His presence preceded the worst moments like a shadow walking just ahead of the storm. Then there was 11. She followed the trail the way she always did, through the dark, through her mind, through the ripple of echoes left behind by people and things. She wasn't trying to find Jonathan, she was trying to find Vecna, but what she stumbled into was colder, older. It wasn't Vecna's rage, it was something deeper, ancient and still. It wore Jonathan's face, not a twisted version, not a monster mask, just him, expressionless, watching, waiting. The confrontation was inevitable. They gathered in Hopper's cabin, Joyce, Will, Nancy, and Elle. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, silent, like he had already heard everything they were going to say. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. The only emotion he showed was sorrow, like he'd finally stopped pretending and all that was left was grief. No one accused him outright. They didn't have to. The air in the room told the story for them. Lights dimmed when he breathed too deeply. A plant withered in the corner when he stepped near it. The fire in the hearth flickered and collapsed into smoke. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The link was permanent now. The Mind Flayer no longer needed to speak to him in whispers or dreams. It was there, behind his eyes, pulsing inside his chest like a second heart. It didn't possess him, not in the way it had with Will. It had grown with him, fed on his anger, used his loneliness as a root system, and now, after years of subtle influence, it was part of who he was. They didn't know what to do with that. How do you kill something that still bleeds? How do you save someone who may not want to be saved? Joyce tried to hold on to hope. She combed through files, old newspaper clippings, anything that hinted at psychic links, energy transfers, alternative ways to sever the connection, but there were no solutions, only warnings. Once tethered, the host was a conduit, a walking, breathing gate. Closing it would collapse everything on either side. That included Hawkins. That included Jonathan. Will didn't speak for days. When he finally did, he asked if this was his fault, if something about their family had attracted the darkness, if maybe, just maybe, it was all meant to end this way. No one answered. Nancy wanted to fight. She gathered weapons, maps. She said they could fix this, but every time she looked at Jonathan, she hesitated. He still smiled the same way sometimes, still asked if she was okay before he said anything about himself. And yet, when he walked past a mirror, it cracked. The final descent came when the gate at the town center split wide. The sky turned black. Red lightning danced above the trees. Creatures poured through. Demobats, vines, twisted humanoid forms that screamed without mouths. But at the heart of it all, there was still only one true source, one beacon guiding the swarm. Jonathan. He walked into the storm on his own. Not to surrender, but to finish it. He didn't bring weapons. He didn't need them. The ground curled under his feet. The monsters didn't attack. They bowed their heads, as if unsure whether to kill him or worship him. The Mind Flayer had waited for this moment. It had shaped its tether carefully. Jonathan stood in the eye of the storm, and for the first time, the entity revealed itself. Not as a beast, not as a shadow, as a mirror. A perfect copy of Jonathan, stitched together from memory and pain. It didn't speak with words. It spoke through feeling. Through every disappointment, every moment of isolation, every time he felt invisible in his own life. He understood them. It had never needed to take control. He had already given it everything. 11 was the only one who could reach him. She entered the storm with blood on her face and memories held like weapons. She didn't try to fight the Mind Flayer. She spoke to the part of Jonathan still watching from inside the void. The boy who loved the clash. The boy who stayed home to protect Will. The boy who saved Nancy with nothing but a camera and a baseball bat. He didn't respond, but he listened. And in the end, that was enough. He turned. The storm rippled. The swarm screamed. The Mind Flayer roared, not with words, but with fear. Jonathan stepped forward into his reflection, and the world shook. No one knows what exactly happened in that moment. Some say Jonathan sacrificed himself, severing the link from the inside and collapsing the gate with it. Others believe 11 anchored his mind long enough for him to pull back from the edge, taking the Mind Flayer with him into a space between worlds, trapped but alive. Joyce never confirmed either version. All she said was that the boy who came back wasn't quite the same. He slept more, smiled less, sometimes stared out the window for hours, but he was kind, he was present, and he never had another nosebleed again. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.